Thank you, Jeremy. So my research is on teacher education. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon a little bit about what I did last year as far as my MPhil research, which was laid the basis a little bit for my current PhD work. It's entitled Novice Teachers in Democracy, Community Choice, Curriculum, and Curriculum in Conflict. We're going to take a look a little bit, see what that means. So my research focused on what's called democratic citizenship education, which you can see here. We're obviously citizens in a democracy. We vote, we are entitled to our free ideas. And so democratic citizenship education is a process where our education system, our schools, prepare future citizens to be members of this democracy. So teach them the functions, the values, the institutions, all the things that are important to keep our democracy going. And we can see these concepts all the way back to classical writers, Plato, Rousseau, Jefferson, Horace Mann, who's considered the founder of public state education in the US. But it's not until 1916, just about 100 years ago, that John Dewey, the father of progressive education, coined this term democratic education. He famously wrote in Democracy and Education that democracy is more than a form of government. It's primarily a mode of associated living of conjoint communicated experience. Because these early writers about democracy, Plato, Rousseau, they are very often focus on democracy and the role of democratic citizens as being obedient, as being voters. That's how you're a democratic citizen, by following rules. Dewey's saying, no, you know what, there's something a little bit more to it than that. And my research is kind of getting at, well, how do we teach that a little bit more? So how do we define it? Amy Gutman in the 80s and then later in the 90s defined her view of democracy. She said that a democratic society is neither repressive nor discriminatory. So in other words, society can't tell you this is how you have to think, and it can't tell you if you think this way or you are this way, we can't exclude you. So that's all well and good. So she says then that democratic education is that which creates two things. First, cohesive communities that are able to get along, are functional, people aren't fighting and killing each other, but also has deliberative choice. It has both of these features without elevating one to a higher position than the other. One is not more important than the other. That's all well and good, but that's a little bit of a paradox. How can you have a society that's perfectly coherent, but also has perfect deliberative choice? You know, if we were perfectly coherent, then we'd all agree on what music to listen to. But then you obviously don't have any sort of deliberative choice there. So this is a very nice theoretical definition of democratic citizenship education, but it's very hard to measure empirically. So how are we going to do that? So I turned to writings by a man named Bernard Crick, who chaired a report in the early 2000s known as the Crick Report. And this body, they looked at democratic education in state schools here in the UK. And they came up with three indicators of what citizenship education was: social moral responsibility, political literacy, and community involvement. And if you think about it, these closely relate to Gutman's view that it's community and choice. So you have community, social moral responsibility, understanding your political system, knowing who your elected leaders are, being involved in your community. The two are closely related. So this is a framework that I kind of use to examine this. Again, though, this is very kind of wishy-washy. How do you measure it? So I use these as kind of different indicators that I would look for in teachers' opinions. So my specific research question here is, to what extent do trainee teachers, in other words, teachers undergoing teacher education in different teacher education programs, have attitudes and philosophies of education in which democratic citizenship education is a key component? Do they think it's important or not? To what extent? And the two sub-questions go along with this. Where do these attitudes and opinions come from? Is it from their teacher education? Is it from their classroom experience? Is it from their own experience growing up? Some other feature of their life that's making this an opinion? And second of all, these teacher education programs, how are they impacting the trainee teachers' beliefs? So to do this, I looked at two teacher education programs here in the UK. The first was the Cambridge PGCE, the Postgraduate Certificate of Education, and the second is Teach First, modeled after Teach for America in the US, was exported here to UK. You see similar programs around the globe actually now. The Cambridge PGCE is a traditional teacher education course. It's a one-year postgraduate course. Predominantly, at the beginning of the year, it's classroom-based, classroom as in here at the Faculty of Education, lectures, group discussions, things like that. And then as the year progresses, it shifts to a field experience, to classroom teaching. The Teach First program is one of these alternate routes to teaching. And the idea behind Teach First is that they'll take the best and the brightest graduates in the country. You know, people, if you look at the selection process, you have 2 1s for their undergraduate degree. The best and the brightest, Oxbridge students, Russell Group graduates, and they say, all right, we're going to give them a crash course in teaching over the summer. 6 weeks where they learn everything there is to learn about teaching. And then stick them in the most high-need schools, which in the UK largely is urban schools, socioeconomically disadvantaged schools. And the US also includes rural schools as well. And the idea is that these student teachers are so brilliant, they're such geniuses, they're the Oxbridge elite, that their knowledge will just exude onto these students. And these students will be able to lift themselves out of the socioeconomic disadvantage that they find themselves in. And all will be well with the world. So I chose these 2 programs. They're very similar. If you kind of look at their side-to-side rankings, they're both very prestigious, highly rated. Cambridge, I got the first ever perfect score from Ofsted, and I believe that it's still the only one to date. Very rigorous selection processes. So this is good because it allows us to do some nice comparisons, because they're just similar enough and just different enough to see some interesting things going on. So, how did I go about doing this? I did a comparative case study where I selected 6 Cambridge PGC students and 6 Teach First participants. And there were 3 major components to this. The first were interviews conducted with the participants, semi-structured. And the second was document analysis. I looked at lesson plans that they created and their explanations of these lesson plans, and also document analysis of the 2 programs to get an idea of what's going on in the programs, what's going on in these classes. Obviously, I couldn't go and, for this short-term 5-month study, drop everything and do observations and these things, although that would have been nice. So looking quickly at the samples, we had 6 from each. It wasn't a perfect sampling process. Teachers are very notoriously busy people and very difficult to get as participants. And when you get student teachers, people studying to be teachers, even more so. So I would send out these pleas for participants and get minimal responses. But fortunately, actually, through the college network, actually, there were a lot of my participants were former Jesuits who said, oh, you know, so-and-so's doing Teach First, so-and-so's doing PGC, which could have obviously perhaps biased the results a little bit. But it was a nice sample size, a nice balance between gender, backgrounds, and the subjects that they were teaching. So a little bit about the interviews. Talked a little bit about their backgrounds, their motivations. Why did you become a teacher? Why did you choose this program? Just to get an idea of where they are, break the ice a little bit. Then I started to get into, all right, what's your philosophy of education? The way I did this was through a card selection process. So I provided 10 cards, one of which was other, and you can see on the right here some of the samples of what those cards said. I said, okay, looking at these cards, which would you say best describes your view of what the purpose of education is? Why did you choose this? What does it mean? So we talked about the cards. They got to choose up to 3 cards that they could choose as the purpose of education. After we kind of established their philosophy, I gave them the definition of democratic citizenship education. I said, okay, you've talked about your views. Here's a different view about the purpose of education. What do you think about this? And kind of let them talk a little bit about that. So, what did we find? First of all, most of the useful data did not come from their card selection or from the lesson plans, but rather the participants' commentary about it. And we'll see in a second some of the cards that the participants chose. And perhaps maybe it said socially and morally responsible behavior, for example. Well, that's all well and good, but then their explanation and interpretation of what that meant actually yielded the most useful information about what their ideas are. But they were still very helpful as a prompt for them to get talking. 3 major themes also emerged from the study, and we'll go into detail about each of those. Talking about what the teacher education programs, in other words, the PGC and Teach First, what they saw as the purpose of education, what the influences on the teachers were, and what specifically their ideas were about democratic citizenship education. So looking at the two programs, neither had explicit views about the concept of democratic citizenship education. If you look at their curricula, if you look at their lessons that they would do, the lectures they provided, democratic education didn't really come up at all. And the PGC here at Cambridge seemed to have an unclear purpose of education. If you ask the participants, okay, so your faculty, your professors, what would they say is the purpose of education? I had 6 different participants giving 5 different answers about what they said they thought Cambridge's view of purpose of education was, which is interesting, but a little bit beyond the purview of this study. The vision of Teach First is very clear, and that was what I was talking about earlier, this view that the best and the brightest can raise the socioeconomic gap and provide every student the opportunities for them to succeed. The interesting thing is that pretty much all of the Teach First participants saw this as their vision. But is that the vision of education or the vision of the program? If the socioeconomic gap were suddenly magically closed, what would Teach First say the purpose of education is? There's a little bit of a difference there. And this is nicely illustrated here by one of my participants. He said, I think Teach First are very, very explicit about their mission. The way I think they sell themselves is that you come into this program to make a difference to a huge problem in society. And that's true. If you look at all the Teach First literature, their recruitment materials, their website, the content of their 6-month training course, the whole thing is driving home this idea of closing the socioeconomic gap. So it's very, very clear what their view is. But again, that's a view of the program, not for a purpose of education. Talking about what influenced the participants, PGC students had a wide range of influences. None of them really said that their program was what influenced their philosophy, though. They didn't say it was their lectures, their professors, their readings. They listed a whole bunch of other things. Their own schooling, their own view of the world, how they were raised by their parents, certain values that they had. Cultural experiences actually came up in a bunch of the participants' interviews. 3 of them had, interestingly, spent time schooling abroad, in their schooling abroad, which could perhaps been a very significant influence. And one also talks about being an outsider, moving from a large city to a very small rural town, and kind of being viewed as the outsider in town, and how that influenced her view of community. They mentioned their school placements. They didn't necessarily say it was an influence in their philosophy. What about the Teach First students? What was their influence? Their school placements. All 6 listed the sole influence as their school placements, where they did their student teaching, their practicum. And if you think about the schools that they were placed in, all 6 of them mentioned this, they're very difficult schools. They talked about students who did not have a supportive home life, where regular attendance was a problem, the students were socioeconomically disadvantaged. And they were very, very conscientious of the fact even that these settings were what was influencing their philosophy. We'll see in a second, one of them said, oh, I used to think this was the purpose of education. Now I actually started teaching and now this is what I think. And they said because working with these students has made them change their opinion. Now what's interesting is perhaps the Teach First program primed them for this. We mentioned that 6-week course. That entire time, again, they're being driven home. These students are disadvantaged. These students don't have the same opportunities you have had. And perhaps the program is what's influencing this idea, although they didn't recognize that per se. 2 quotations here. PGC participant said, I was exposed to lots of different cultures, lots of different religions and ways of life at my school growing up. She said that was what influenced her philosophy. Teach First participant said, but for the school I'm working in, academia and education is a low priority, so I've changed my opinion about the purpose of education. Really, really interesting stuff. Looking at the card selection for what the participants chose to represent their philosophy of education, PGC students were very varied in what they chose. There wasn't really a large pattern to what they saw. Their views, though, were generally aligned with democratic citizenship education. So very often they would talk about community. They would talk about critical thinking. If you think back to Gutman's definition of cohesive communities and deliberative choice, those views are similar, they're parallel. Interestingly, though, if you look at their practice, if you look at their lesson plans, although this is a big part of their philosophy of education, it's not present in the practice. It's not actually there. So they're all in favor of it, they just don't have the tools to implement it. So these are the cards they chose. So each row represents a different participant, and each column then is a different choices they make, different card they had selected. So if you look, it's very, very varied. You know, there are, I think, only one repeat here. Teach socially and morally responsible behavior, yeah, appears in Andrea and Christopher's selection. And the rest is really very varied. Not too many patterns to be seen there. They talked about various different themes. Like I said, community came about. Switch to Teach First. Teach First, less variety in their card selection. We'll see in a second what they chose. A lot more similarities. 2 or 3 cards made reappearances. They also talked about community and individual success. Their definition of community, though, is very different from the PGC students. PGC students talk about community in the sense of working together, coming together as society, cooperating, versus the Teach First students talked about community in the sense of conforming, being part of, being accepted by society. They also talked a lot about success, which they defined as gaining employment. Almost a very neoliberal approach to producing, being a cog in the system, being accepted for that. They had very mixed reactions to the concept of democratic citizenship education. Some said, yeah, okay, that's a nice concept. I don't have time for it, though. I have tests I need to prepare the students for. Some actually said explicitly, no, it's not my role to teach democracy. They said, my job is to teach them so they can pass their tests so they can get a job, whether it's a police officer or a bin collector, a rubbish collector. And that's actually a quote that one of them said. Similar to the PGC students, they were unsuccessful at implementing this. So they didn't have the tools to implement it. So yeah, let's look at their selection here. We can see there are a couple patterns here. Provide the skills necessary comes up in a whole bunch as a first and second choice. Teach socially and morally responsible behavior, also reappears in a couple. And 1 or 2 selected a holistic approach to education as well. So much more of a shared view here amongst the Teach First participants. Again, let's take a look at some quotes here that illustrate this. PGCE student said, the idea of the cohesive community is the idea of being part of something bigger and being an active, positive part of that bigger something. Knowing you are a piece of the puzzle. So there's that view of community about joining together, being a piece of the puzzle. Will from Teach First said the role of education is helping them learn what sort of behavior, what sort of skills and knowledge is going to make them well-liked and valued by society is probably important for them. So all this in mind, now what? Where do we go from there? What's the next step? First thing is trying to figure out what about these programs is influencing these students. There is obviously some difference between the two. It raises a couple questions. If the PGC students had been placed in the same schools that Teach First students had, what would their opinion be? Would they start sounding more like Teach First students? If the Teach First students had been given a 1-year education course like the PGC students, would they start sounding like the PGC students? What about it is causing these differences? And I wasn't able to kind of come conclusively with an argument what that is. Also, is it true in other programs? If you look at other PGC programs, if you look at other alternate routes to teacher certification, do we find the same effects? If we decide, as a society, we value democratic citizenship education, how do we provide the teachers to be successful in this? We said that the teachers from PGC, they were all for it, but when push came to shove, it wasn't there. They didn't have the tools. So how do we provide those tools? And then how do we design and implement teacher preparation programs that do encourage different philosophies? At the same time, should we? Should we have programs that teach teachers to encourage democracy? That's something that I don't take a normative stance on, but rather society needs to come together and all the factors, the teachers, the schools, the politicians all need to decide as a cohesive community, have deliberative choice, decide what the value of democracy is in our education. So, thank you.
Sujay, sir, any questions? Go on, John.
Thank
in your card survey, do you think it'd be interesting to look at what they thought was the least important of the available cards?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, what I'm currently designing for my PhD research is a card sort that involves Q methodology, which actually involves ranking all 10 cards, or however many cards, from most agree to most disagree with. So this one didn't cover that. So that's kind of one of these next steps.
Yeah, I'm sure you know much more about this than me, but I've seen something the MRC's doing recently where they just, rather than ranking all the cards, they choose most important, then least important, then most important, and then least important. Maybe just so it's quicker, you've got a lot of options.
Yeah, it definitely would be interesting. The thing with some of these cards, too, is that they can be very similar. And so some participants said, oh, well, I'd like to use this card, but I also kind of like this card and this card. Which is also kind of why their explanations about the cards were so important.
No.
Yeah, I wonder, and I imagine this is something that is more germane to the PhD program. It's supposed to be 1-year research thing. If you're taking into account, well, people's identities or socioeconomic status before going to either of these things, because I can see like the difference between saying, oh, education, we should be teaching these kids Aristotle or Plato maybe because they went to prep school.
Absolutely.
Whereas people who are like, yeah, we should try to give them basic literacy and math skills so they can get a job and stay out of prison.
Right.
It depends also a lot on their own upbringing and their own education. So I was wondering if that's something.
Yeah, so I didn't go into a lot of depth about participants' education background. Most of them, as I said, were Oxbridge, very privileged backgrounds. Most of the Teach First participants in general, not just in this study, I do not identify with the students that they're teaching. You know, they're not from that background. So it is absolutely that effect that you're talking about.
Your comment about the program versus the education, identifying the sort of values of those. Is that something you came up with sort of once you were looking at the results, or sort of did you have that idea? So did you ask the participants about that? Did you sort of press them for it?
It was kind of a hypothesis going in, but it did kind of, as we designed this, I had a bunch of different hypotheses, what could come out, some of them conflicting. I think that the data was what really drove that.
Right.
Do you think, well, it's more of a comment, but you say that you don't really want to come down on one side unilaterally and this is how it should be, but then your explanation of what we should do sounds highly democratic in our decision-making process about whether democracy is good. So I wonder how much is a foregone conclusion if that's part of your methodology?
Yes, it is. And I actually thought you would be the one to pick up on that too. But yes, in my methodology, I do try to be very reflexive. And you know, I am a product of one of these teacher education programs, one of the more traditional ones, that did actually focus on democratic education, multicultural education. And so I did try to remove myself as much as possible from the data analysis. But absolutely.
Well, your bias doesn't show at all during the talk.
But yes, and at the same time too, I am very critical of Teach First and Teach for America for similar reasons, I'd say.
Right, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.